Sarah's alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, the same time it had buzzed every day for the past 8 months. She rolled over and silenced it quickly, hoping it hadn't woken the children. Through the thin walls of their apartment, she could hear Mrs. Chun in the next unit starting her own morning routine, the soft clatter of dishes, and the distant sound of a television news program. Today was Tuesday, which meant Sarah had exactly 24 hours left before the property management company filed eviction papers. She had spent most of the night lying awake, running through increasingly desperate plans. None of them seemed realistic. She had already called every friend, every family member, every potential source of help she could think of. Sarah slipped quietly out of bed and padded to the kitchen in her bare feet. The apartment was cold, and she could see her breath in small puffs as she started the coffee maker. The heating bill had been reduced to the minimum to save money, leaving them all bundling up in extra clothes and blankets. As the coffee brewed, she checked her phone for any messages about job interviews or assistance programs. What she found instead made her heart stop. There was an email from the fundraising website where she had posted their story 2 weeks ago. The subject line read, "Congratulations. Your campaign has been fully funded." Sarah stared at the screen, certain she was misreading something. She had only raised $300 in 2 weeks, mostly small donations from a few kind strangers. There was no way her campaign could be fully funded. She must have received a spam email or clicked on something by mistake. With trembling fingers, she opened the message and read it carefully. Then, she read it again. Then, she sat down hard on one of the kitchen chairs and read it a third time, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. Someone named T. Rodriguez had donated $6,000. The full amount. Her campaign was complete, and the money would be transferred to her account within hours. Sarah felt dizzy. She must be dreaming or having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. She pinched herself hard enough to leave a mark, but the email was still there. $6,000 from a complete stranger who had given no explanation, left no message, just quietly provided exactly what her family needed. She tried to access more information about the donor, but the website only showed the name and the amount. T. Rodriguez could be anyone, anywhere. Sarah had never heard that name before, had no connection to anyone who might have that kind of money to give away. The coffee maker beeped, and Sarah jumped as if she had been shot. Her heart was racing so fast that she felt lightheaded. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. There had to be some mistake, some catch that would make this miracle evaporate as quickly as it had appeared. She called the website's customer service number, expecting to be told that there had been an error, that the donation would be reversed, that she was foolish to have believed it was real. But the representative confirmed everything. The donation was legitimate, the money was real, and it would be in her bank account before noon. Sarah hung up the phone and immediately burst into tears. Not the quiet, controlled crying she had been doing for weeks, but huge, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. She covered her face with her hands and let herself fall apart completely for the first time since David had left. She cried for the fear that had been eating at her for months, for the nights she had lain awake wondering how she would explain homelessness to her children, for the shame of having to ask for help from strangers on the internet. But, mostly, she cried from relief so overwhelming that it felt like a physical weight lifting off her shoulders. "Mommy!" Emma's small voice came from the doorway. Sarah looked up to see her daughter standing there in her worn pajamas, her dark hair messy from sleep, and her eyes wide with concern. "Why are you crying? Are we okay?" Sarah opened her arms, and Emma ran to her, climbing onto her lap like she had when she was smaller. Jake appeared moments later, rubbing his eyes and looking confused by the emotional scene in their kitchen. "We're more than okay, baby," Sarah whispered into Emma's hair. "We're going to be fine. Someone helped us. Someone we don't even know helped us stay in our home." She tried to explain what had happened in words that her children could understand. Emma listened with the serious expression she wore when trying to process grown-up information. Jake seemed to accept the news with the easy adaptability of a 5-year-old, more interested in the promise of breakfast than the details of their salvation. "Are you happy crying?" Emma asked, studying her mother's face with the perceptive eyes of a child who had seen too much sadness lately. "Very happy crying." Sarah confirmed, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. The happiest crying I've ever done. Later that morning, after she had dropped the children at school and confirmed that the money had indeed appeared in her bank account, Sarah drove to the property management office. She had never been so eager to pay a bill in her entire life. The receptionist looked surprised to see her. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wasn't expecting you today. Are you here to discuss your payment plan?" "I'm here to pay in full," Sarah said, pulling out her checkbook with hands that were still slightly shaky. "All back rent, all fees, everything." The woman's eyebrows shot up. "In full? That's wonderful. Let me get your account information." As Sarah wrote the check for $6,000, she thought about T. Rodriguez, whoever he or she was. She had tried to find more information online, but Rodriguez was a common name, and she had no other details to go on. All she knew was that somewhere out there was a person who had seen her story and decided to change her family's life forever. After leaving the property management office with a receipt and a promise that all eviction proceedings would be stopped immediately, Sarah drove to her morning job at the diner with a lightness in her chest that she hadn't felt in months. For the first time in weeks, she was able to focus on her work instead of constantly worrying about their future. "You seem different today," commented Rosa, the diner's longtime cook, as Sarah refilled coffee cups with unusual enthusiasm. "Something good happened?" Sarah told Rosa the story, and soon word had spread throughout the small diner. By lunchtime, every regular customer knew about the mysterious benefactor who had saved the Mitchell family from eviction. The story seemed to lift everyone's spirits, a reminder that kindness still existed in the world. That evening, after Sarah had picked up the children and they had celebrated with pizza from their favorite restaurant, she sat down at her computer to write a thank you message to T. Rodriguez through the fundraising website. She wrote and rewrote the message a dozen times, trying to find words adequate to express what his gift meant to her family. "I don't know who you are or why you chose to help us," she finally wrote. "But I want you to know that your generosity has literally saved my family. Emma and Jake will be able to sleep in their own beds tonight because of your kindness. I will spend the rest of my life trying to pay this forward to help other families the way you helped mine. Thank you doesn't seem like enough, but it's all I have. Thank you, from the bottom of our hearts." 3 days later, Sarah received a response that surprised her even more than the original donation. T. Rodriguez had written back, and the message was brief but warm. "Dear Sarah, I'm glad I could help. Your children remind me that every family deserves a safe place to call home. I lost my wife a few years ago, and she always said that money was meant to flow where it's needed most. Consider this a gift from both of us. Take care of those beautiful children. Tom Rodriguez." Tom, the mysterious benefactor, had a first name now, and Sarah could picture him as a real person rather than just an anonymous donor. She imagined him as someone who had loved his wife deeply, someone who understood loss and chose to respond with generosity rather than bitterness. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Tom exchanged occasional messages through the website. She learned that he was a rancher in Texas, that he had served in the Army, that he and his late wife had never had children of their own but had always loved helping young families. Tom learned that Sarah was working toward her nursing degree through online classes, that Emma wanted to be a teacher, that Jake was obsessed with dinosaurs and drew pictures of them constantly. 1 month after the donation, Tom surprised Sarah with another message. "Sarah, I know this might seem strange, but I was wondering if you and the kids would be interested in visiting the ranch sometime. I have more space than I need, and it might be nice for Emma and Jake to see what life is like outside the city. No pressure, just an invitation if you're ever interested." Sarah stared at the message for a long time. The idea of meeting Tom in person was both exciting and terrifying. He had given them so much already, had asked for nothing in return. The thought of imposing on his hospitality seemed wrong, but she could also picture how much her children would love seeing a real ranch. She showed the message to Emma, reading it aloud while they sat together on the couch after Jake had gone to bed. "He wants us to visit?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "The man who helped us? That's what he says. What do you think?" Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the invitation with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. "I think he must be lonely," she said finally. "I think maybe he needs friends." Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah realized that Emma might be right. Tom had lost his wife, lived alone on a ranch in rural Texas. Maybe his generosity came not just from kindness, but from a desire for connection, for the family he had never had. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself driving south on Interstate 35 with Emma and Jake chattering excitedly in the back seat. They had planned the trip carefully, arranging for Sarah to take time off from both jobs and packing enough clothes for a long weekend at the Rodriguez Ranch. As they approached the address Tom had given them, Sarah felt nervous butterflies in her stomach. What if they didn't get along in person? What if the visit was awkward or uncomfortable? What if Tom regretted his invitation? But when they pulled up the gravel driveway and saw Tom waiting on his front porch, all of Sarah's worries evaporated. He was exactly what she had imagined, a tall, weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and a genuine smile. He wore worn jeans and boots, and his face lit up when he saw Emma and Jake tumble out of the car. "You must be Emma," he said, extending his hand formally to the 8-year-old. "And this must be Jake. I'm Tom. Welcome to our ranch." Jake immediately began bombarding Tom with questions about his horses and cattle, while Emma hung back shyly until Tom mentioned that he had a barn cat who had recently had kittens. Within minutes, both children were following him eagerly toward the barn, their initial nervousness forgotten. Sarah stood in the driveway for a moment, watching her children with the man who had changed their lives. Tom was patient with their questions, pointing out different animals and explaining how the ranch operated. He had prepared for their visit, setting up a small area in the guest room with books and toys he had purchased especially for them. That evening, after a dinner of homemade chili and cornbread eaten on the front porch while watching the sunset, Emma and Jake fell asleep almost immediately in the guest room, exhausted from their day of exploration. Sarah and Tom sat on the porch swing, listening to the sounds of the Texas night and talking quietly about their lives. "I have a confession," Tom said as they watched the stars appear in the darkening sky. "I wasn't entirely truthful in my message. I didn't just invite you here because I thought you might enjoy it. I invited you because I needed this too. This house has been too quiet for too long." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "Emma said she thought you might be lonely. She's very perceptive for an 8-year-old. Smart kid. They both are. You should be proud. I am. And, Tom, I can never thank you enough for what you did for us. You saved our family." Tom shook his head. "You were already saving your family. You were working 2 jobs, doing everything you could to take care of your children. All I did was help you over one hurdle. You were going to find a way with or without me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Tom spoke again. "Maria would have loved meeting you and the kids. She always wanted to fill this house with the sound of children's laughter." "I wish I could have met her," Sarah said softly. "She raised a good man." As the weekend progressed, it became clear that this was the beginning of something special. Emma and Jake flourished under Tom's patient attention, and he seemed to come alive in their presence. By Sunday morning, when it was time to leave, Jake was crying at the prospect of saying goodbye to the horses, and Emma was begging to know when they could come back. "Anytime you want," Tom said, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "This will always be your second home." As they drove away, Sarah looked in her rearview mirror to see Tom standing on his porch, waving until they disappeared around the curve in the road. She knew they would be back soon, knew that their lives had been forever changed not just by his generosity, but by the unexpected family they had found in each other. 6 months later, Sarah finished her nursing degree and found a job at a hospital in Austin, just an hour from Tom's ranch. Emma and Jake spent every other weekend with their honorary grandfather, learning to ride horses and helping with ranch chores. Tom had a family again, and Sarah had found the father figure her children had been missing. The cycle of generosity continued too. Inspired by Tom's example, Sarah began volunteering at a women's shelter, using her nursing skills to help families in crisis. Emma started a fundraiser at her school to help other children whose families were struggling. Even Jake, in his own 5-year-old way, began sharing his toys with children who had less. Tom's simple act of kindness had rippled outward, touching more lives than he could have ever imagined. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes, and sometimes a family is not just the people you're born to, but the people who choose to love you when you need it most. Tom Rodriguez pushed his worn cowboy hat back on his head and surveyed the morning landscape from his front porch. The storm that had rolled through the night before had left the air clean and crisp, with puddles reflecting the early sunlight like scattered mirrors across his ranch. At 62, Tom had seen thousands of mornings like this one, but he never tired of the peace that came with sunrise on his land. The coffee in his hands was strong and black, just like his father had taught him to drink it 40 years ago. Tom's weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic mug, feeling its warmth seep into his joints that had grown stiff from decades of ranch work. His cattle were already moving toward the far pasture, their hooves making soft, squelching sounds in the mud-soaked ground. This ranch had been his life for over 30 years. After leaving the Army in his early 30s, Tom had used his savings and a loan to buy these 300 acres of Texas hill country. It hadn't been much then, just rolling grassland with an old farmhouse that needed everything from new wiring to a complete roof replacement. But Tom had seen potential where others saw problems. He had rebuilt the house with his own hands, working weekends and evenings while holding down a job at a construction company in town. Those had been lean years, surviving on beans and rice while every spare dollar went into improvements. But gradually, the ranch had taken shape. The house became a home, the pastures became productive, and the small herd of cattle he had started with grew into a profitable operation. Tom's wife Maria had joined him on this journey 8 years into it, bringing her own dreams and a laugh that could chase away the darkest moods. Together, they had built something beautiful. Maria had planted gardens that bloomed with vegetables and flowers, had insisted on the wraparound porch where they spent summer evenings watching the sunset. She had filled the house with warmth and love, making it a place where friends and family always felt welcome. The cancer had taken Maria 5 years ago, leaving Tom with memories and an emptiness that never quite went away. But the ranch remained, and with it, the values she had helped him nurture. Maria had always believed in helping others, had never turned away a neighbor in need or failed to offer assistance to anyone who asked. Tom finished his coffee and set the mug on the porch railing. He had work to do, fences to check, and cattle to move, but something was nagging at him this morning. He had woken up with an odd feeling, a sense that someone, somewhere, needed help. It was the kind of intuition that Maria used to tease him about, calling it his guardian angel radar. He walked to the barn where his horse, Thunder, was already waiting by the gate. The black gelding had been his companion for 8 years now, steady and reliable in the way that only a good horse could be. Thunder nickered softly as Tom approached, bumping his nose against Tom's shoulder in greeting. As Tom saddled Thunder, his mind wandered to a conversation he had overheard at the feed store the previous day. 2 women had been talking about families struggling in the city, about children going hungry, and parents working multiple jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. The conversation had stuck with him, bothering him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Tom had grown up poor himself, the son of migrant workers who followed the harvests across Texas and beyond. He remembered the shame of wearing clothes that didn't fit, the gnawing hunger that came when work was scarce, the constant fear of not having enough. His parents had worked themselves to the bone to give their children a better life, and Tom had never forgotten the struggles that had shaped his early years. The Army had given him structure and purpose, but, more importantly, it had given him the GI Bill that helped him get an education and the discipline to save money for his dreams. Not everyone had those opportunities. Not everyone had the luxury of building something for themselves on a piece of land where they could control their own destiny. As he rode out to check the northern pasture, Tom found himself thinking about his own children. He and Maria had never been blessed with kids of their own, something that had caused them both deep pain for many years. They had tried everything, had gone through countless doctor visits and treatments, but it simply wasn't meant to be. Eventually, they had found peace with their situation and had channeled their parental instincts into helping other people's children. Over the years, they had quietly helped several families in their community. When the Garcia family had lost their home to a fire, Tom and Maria had offered them a place to stay in their guest house until they could get back on their feet. When young Tommy Patterson needed money for college, They had provided an interest-free loan that he was still paying back in small amounts years later. They had never asked for recognition or thanks, had simply done what felt right. Tom guided Thunder through the gate that led to the northern section of his property. The cattle were spread out across the pasture, contentedly grazing on grass that was still wet with morning dew. Everything looked good here, no problems with the fencing or signs of predators. But his mind remained elsewhere, fixed on that strange feeling that had woken him up. He pulled out his phone, an old model that he used mainly for emergencies and staying in touch with his few close friends. There was a missed call from his neighbor, Pete Williams, who ran a smaller ranch about 5 miles east. Tom called him back, expecting to discuss plans for the community barbecue they helped organize every summer. "Tom, you ever look at those online fundraising things?" Pete asked without preamble. "My daughter showed me this website where people can ask for help with medical bills and such." "Can't say that I have," Tom replied, adjusting his hat against the strengthening sun. "Why?" "Well, she was showing me some of the stories on there, and it got me thinking. There's folks out there with real problems, families that need help. Made me wonder if there was something we could do." Tom sat straighter in his saddle. This felt like more than coincidence. "What kind of stories?" "All kinds. Medical expenses, families losing their homes, kids who need help with school costs. There was one that really got to me, about a single mom with 2 little ones who's about to be evicted. Works 2 jobs, but still can't make ends meet." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. He could picture his own mother in that situation, could remember the fear in her eyes during their own family's darkest times. "What's her story?" Pete's voice grew softer. "Name's Sarah Mitchell. Lives up in Dallas somewhere. Husband left her with 2 kids, 8 and 5 years old. She's working herself to death trying to keep a roof over their heads. But she's 3 months behind on rent and facing eviction." Tom felt his chest tighten with emotion. Dallas was only about 4 hours from his ranch, close enough that this woman felt like a neighbor rather than a stranger. "How much does she need?" $6,000 to catch up on rent and fees. Might as well be $6 million for someone in her position. $6,000. Tom spent more than that on hay some years. It was a significant amount for most people, but for a successful rancher like himself, it was manageable. Not easy, but possible. "Send me the link to her story," Tom said quietly. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" "Maybe. Just send me the link." Tom rode back toward the house with Pete's promise to text him the information. As Thunder's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the dirt path, Tom found himself thinking about Maria. She would have loved this, would have been the first to suggest they help. She had always said that money was meant to flow like water, meant to go where it was needed most. Back at the house, Tom sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, a machine that Maria had insisted he learn to use even though he much preferred doing business face-to-face or over the phone. The fundraising website was simple enough to navigate, and it didn't take him long to find Sarah Mitchell's story. Her photo showed a tired but determined-looking woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed forced. The pictures of her children showed 2 beautiful kids with bright faces and innocent expressions. Emma, the 8-year-old, had her mother's eyes. Jake, the 5-year-old, was grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious joy that only young children possessed. Tom read Sarah's story carefully. She had written it simply, without self-pity or dramatic language. She explained her situation honestly, talked about her jobs and her efforts to make things work. She mentioned that she had never asked for help before, that she had always believed in taking care of her own problems. But, for her children's sake, she was swallowing her pride and reaching out to strangers. The fundraising campaign had been active for 2 weeks and had raised only $300 from a handful of small donations. Tom was running out for the Mitchell family. Tom sat back in his chair and thought about the money in his savings account. He was comfortable, but not wealthy. The ranch provided a good living, but he was also approaching retirement age and needed to be careful about his finances. $6,000 was a significant chunk of money, even for him. But then, he thought about Sarah's children sleeping in their beds, probably unaware of how close they were to losing their home. He thought about Emma trying to be grown up and help her mother, and about Jake still believing that everything would work out okay. He thought about his own childhood, about the fear and uncertainty that had marked those early years. Most of all, he thought about Maria. He could almost hear her voice in his head, could imagine her shaking her head at his hesitation. Tom Rodriguez, she would have said, what good is money sitting in a bank when there are children who need a place to sleep? Tom pulled out his phone and called his bank. He had enough in his savings account to cover the full amount Sarah needed, and he could transfer it immediately. The bank representative walked him through the process of making the donation through the website, explaining how the funds would be held until the goal was reached and then released to the recipient. But Tom had a different idea. What if I want to donate the full amount myself? Can I do that? Certainly, sir. The platform allows for full funding by a single donor. Would you like to proceed with that? Tom looked again at the pictures of Sarah and her children. Emma's forced smile reminded him of his sister at that age, trying to be brave when their father was out of work for 3 months. Jake's innocent grin reminded him of every child who deserved to feel safe and secure in their own home. Yes, he said firmly. Let's do the full amount. The process took about 20 minutes. Tom provided his banking information and verified his identity multiple times. When it was finished, the bank representative confirmed that $6,000 would be transferred to Sarah Mitchell's fundraising account within 24 hours. After hanging up, Tom sat quietly in his kitchen for a long time. He felt a mix of emotions, satisfaction at being able to help, nervous anticipation about Sarah's reaction, and a deep sense of rightness about the decision. Maria would have been proud of him. That evening, Tom sat on his front porch with a beer and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The cattle were settling down for the night, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire of stolen songs. His phone buzzed with a text from Pete Williams. Did you help that family? Tom typed back. Maybe. You're a good man, Tom Rodriguez. Tom didn't reply to that. He wasn't looking for praise or recognition. He had simply done what felt right, what Maria would have wanted him to do. Somewhere in Dallas, a mother was probably putting her children to bed, maybe for the last time in their own home. Tomorrow, she would wake up to find that a stranger had changed everything for her family. Tom finished his beer and headed inside. He had early morning chores to do, and Thunder would be expecting his breakfast at dawn. Life on the ranch didn't stop for anything, not even for small miracles. But as he turned off the porch light and headed to bed, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The deep satisfaction that came from knowing he had made a real difference in someone's life. Maria would have loved this feeling, would have stayed up half the night talking about Sarah and her children and wondering how they would react to their unexpected blessing. Tomorrow would bring the next chapter of this story, the moment when Sarah Mitchell would discover that sometimes help comes from the most unlikely places, from people who understand that kindness is meant to be shared, not hoarded. Tom smiled as he drifted off to sleep, already looking forward to whatever came next. The rain hammered against the windows of the small apartment like angry fists, each drop carrying with it the weight of Sarah Mitchell's worries. She stood at the kitchen sink, washing the same plate for the 3rd time, her mind elsewhere as she watched the water swirl down the drain. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all week had finally arrived, bringing with it the kind of darkness that seemed to seep into her bones. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set the plate aside. It wasn't from the cold, though the old building's heating system had been struggling for months. The trembling came from a deeper place, from the constant pressure that had been building in her chest for weeks now. The eviction notice lay crumpled in the trash can, though its words were burned into her memory. 30 days to come up with 3 months of back rent, or she and her 2 children would be out on the streets. Behind her, she could hear the soft murmur of her children's voices from their shared bedroom. 8-year-old Emma was reading to her younger brother Jake, her voice taking on different tones for each character in the story. At 5 years old, Jake still believed in happy endings, still thought that problems always worked themselves out by the final page. Sarah envied that innocence, that unshakable faith that everything would be okay. She dried her hands on the worn dish towel and walked to their bedroom door, leaning against the frame as she watched her daughter's patient teaching. Emma had grown up too fast since David left. At 8, she already understood that money was tight, that mommy worked 2 jobs, and still couldn't make everything stretch far enough. She never asked for new toys anymore, never complained when dinner was peanut butter sandwiches for the 3rd night in a row. Jake looked up from where he lay sprawled across the bed, his dark hair falling into his eyes. Those eyes were so much like his father's that sometimes Sarah had to look away. But, unlike David, Jake's eyes held warmth and trust, not the restless dissatisfaction that had eventually driven his father to pack his bags one Tuesday morning and never come back. "Mommy, are we going to read the Castle book tonight?" Jake asked, his small face hopeful. The Castle book was a battered fairy tale collection they had found at a yard sale, its pages loose and its cover held on with tape. But, to Jake, it might as well have been made of gold. "Of course, sweetheart," Sarah said, forcing her voice to sound light and carefree. "But first, let's get ready for bed." As she helped them with their nighttime routine, Sarah's mind wandered to the events that had brought them to this point. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, and David had disappeared soon after, taking with him any hope of child support. Sarah had thought she could manage on her own. She had always been resourceful, always found a way to make things work. Her morning job at the diner paid minimum wage, but provided steady hours while the kids were at school. The evening cleaning job at the office building downtown paid a little better, but it meant leaving Emma to watch Jake for a few hours each night. It wasn't ideal, but Mrs. Chun from next door checked on them, and Emma was responsible beyond her years. Still, 2 part-time jobs weren't enough to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and all the little expenses that came with raising 2 children. The car had broken down last month, and the repair bill had eaten up what little savings she had managed to scrape together. That's when she had fallen behind on rent. Sarah tucked Jake into his small bed, pulling the covers up to his chin and brushing his hair back from his forehead. His eyes were already heavy with sleep, but he reached up to wrap his arms around her neck. "I love you, Mommy," he whispered against her ear. "I love you too, baby," she whispered back, her throat tight with emotion. Emma was already in her own bed, her book closed and placed carefully on the small nightstand between their beds. She was trying to act mature, but Sarah could see the questions in her daughter's eyes, the worry that she was too young to fully understand but old enough to sense. "Everything's going to be okay," Sarah said softly, sitting on the edge of Emma's bed. It was what she said every night, and she prayed it wasn't a lie. "I know, Mommy," Emma replied, but her voice was small and uncertain. After the children were asleep, Sarah sat at the tiny kitchen table with a cup of tea and her calculator. She had done these calculations dozens of times before, but she kept hoping that somehow the numbers would change, that she would find money she had forgotten about or discover a mistake in her favor. The rent was $2,000 a month, reasonable for their area, but impossible on her current income. She made about $1,500 a month from both jobs combined, leaving her short even before considering utilities, food, and other necessities. The eviction notice demanded $6,000 to catch up on the 3 months she was behind, plus late fees and court costs. $6,000 might as well have been $6 million. She had already borrowed what she could from friends, had sold everything of value except the children's beds and their few precious belongings. Her parents lived across the country and were struggling with their own medical bills after her father's heart attack. David's family had made it clear that they considered her problems her own fault for not being able to keep their son happy. Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar pressure of a headache building. She had applied for assistance programs, but the waiting lists were long and the requirements complex. She had looked into second jobs, but she was already working as much as she could while still being available for her children. The storm outside was getting worse, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the walls. Sarah flinched at the sound, then laughed bitterly at herself. She was jumping at shadows now, nervous about everything. The stress was getting to her, wearing her down in ways she hadn't expected. She thought about her children's faces, about Jake's innocent trust, and Emma's forced maturity. They deserved better than this constant uncertainty, this fear that hung over their small family like a dark cloud. They deserved a home where they could feel safe and secure, where bedtime stories didn't have to compete with the sound of their mother crying in the next room. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. For a moment, her heart leaped with hope. Maybe it was a call about one of the jobs she had applied for, or perhaps news about an assistance program. But The voice on the other end was cold and professional, belonging to someone from the property management company. Mrs. Mitchell, this is a reminder that your rent payment is now 97 days overdue. If payment is not received within the next 3 days, we will proceed with eviction proceedings. Sarah's heart sank. I understand. I'm working on it. I just need a little more time. Ma'am, you've had 3 months. The property owner has been very patient, but we cannot continue to carry delinquent tenants. 3 days, Mrs. Mitchell. After that, we file with the court. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at the phone in her hand. 3 days. Somehow, that felt even more impossible than 30 had seemed just a week ago. She walked to the window and looked out at the storm-soaked street below. A few cars moved slowly through the rain, their headlights cutting through the darkness like small beacons of hope. Somewhere out there, people were going about their normal lives. People who didn't have to choose between buying groceries and paying utilities. People who could tuck their children into bed without wondering if it would be the last time in their own home. Sarah had never considered herself someone who would end up in this situation. She had gone to college, had worked steady jobs, had thought she was building a stable life for her family. But life had a way of surprising you, of stripping away everything you thought you could count on, and leaving you standing in the wreckage wondering how it had all gone so wrong. She pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders and returned to the kitchen table. The calculator display still showed the same impossible numbers, but she picked it up anyway and started over. Maybe this time, she would find a solution hidden in the addition and subtraction. Maybe this time, the math would work in her favor. Hours passed as she worked through different scenarios, different ways to stretch her income or cut her expenses. She called the utility company and negotiated a payment plan. She looked through job listings online, searching for anything that paid better or offered more hours. She even researched the process for selling blood plasma, though the thought made her stomach turn. By the time she finally went to bed, the storm had passed, leaving behind only the steady drip of water from the gutters and the distant hum of traffic. Sarah lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to her children's quiet breathing from the next room. Tomorrow, she would try again. She would make more phone calls, visit more offices, fill out more applications. She would do whatever it took to keep her family together, to give her children the stability they needed and deserved. She had to believe that somewhere out there was a solution, someone who could help, some opportunity that would change everything. The thought of giving up never crossed her mind. Emma and Jake were counting on her, trusting her to take care of them and keep them safe. She would find a way, no matter what it took. She had to. As sleep finally began to claim her, Sarah whispered a prayer into the darkness. She wasn't particularly religious, but desperation had a way of making believers out of skeptics. She prayed for strength, for wisdom, for some kind of miracle that would save her little family from falling apart. Outside, the city continued its restless pulse, full of stories and struggles and small miracles waiting to unfold. Sarah didn't know it yet, but her prayer was already beginning to find its answer. Carried on the wind toward a ranch several hundred miles away where a man named Tom Rodriguez was having trouble sleeping, his heart heavy with the memory of his own family's darkest days and the overwhelming desire to help others avoid the same pain. The morning would bring new challenges, new fears, and new hopes. But it would also bring the first threads of a connection that would change everything, a reminder that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, in the most unexpected ways. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself dream of better days, of a future where her children could sleep peacefully without the shadow of uncertainty hanging over their small family. She didn't know that hundreds of miles away, someone was dreaming too, someone whose life would soon intersect with theirs in ways none of them could imagine.